Zimbabwe cash crisis worse. About Venezuela once again.
To make important banks. They removed the 1,000 thing called monetary awareness. Hey there, hope all is well. Back at you today with some more RT News updates. And as you tell from today's title, the dollar's days are numbered. I'm going to be covering a recent article from an author on the book that kind of gives a little insight into his thoughts on how the dominance of the dollar is going to come to an end rather sooner than later, as it's stated here. And then also share with you what's happening in the news in regards to currency markets and how a lot of economists and traders in currency are expecting 2018 to be a very tough time for the dollar. So before I dive into those, as always, I want to encourage you to click the subscribe button for more RT News updates, as well as live talk and interviews. And if you're new to RTD, I want to encourage you to visit the Rethinking the Dollar University page, where I put together all my prior interviews dealing with issues such as this, news in regards to the dollar and how nations around the world are beginning to rethink the dollar and making preparations for what I foresee being a major shift in our monetary system in the days ahead. So, as I mentioned, I have about 4 articles, and I want to dive into them, give you a little bit of each one of them. So here's the first article here. It's from Bloomberg Markets, and it says, traders see no end to the dollar's pain in 2018. And it has a little video about minute 47 where a gentleman here from Singapore is sharing his thoughts on how he's not too confident in the dollar of the days ahead. The next one here is from RT, and it says the dollar's days as the world's most important currency are numbered, Berkeley economics professor says, and it's in reference to his most recent book, How Global Currencies Work. And then the next one here is the US dollar dominates global finance, but for how much longer? And it also relates back to this book here. And then the very last one here is from Quartz, and it says the dollar days as the world's most important currency are numbered. And it also references this book I'm referring to, but it also, in this one here, they actually asked the authors a couple questions that I think are quite important in this whole understanding what the dollar's future is all about. And then the last one here is from a blog post I posted earlier, and has to do with the whole disruption in the currency markets, or the fiat currency markets, by the blockchain technology, and how this gentleman here feels that the US dollar, or the US government, Federal Reserve government, may have something in the works for 2018 in the form of some type of blockchain type currency. So before we dive into those, I want to get into this one briefly. And as always, click the links below for more details for yourself. Just want to skim the surface as quickly as I can. And so as I mentioned in the video here, the gentleman shares his thoughts here. And it says, I'll just give you that little bit what's on top. It says, greenbacks drop this year is set to be the worst in over a decade. And so basically it goes through how in the market, the dollar in comparison to other fiat currency isn't doing so well. And so despite all the things you can read here for yourself, at the end of the day, for the consumer dollar especially, it has lost over 96% of its purchasing power and climbing. So I'm not too surprised as to why these gentlemen find it completely out of the box that the Federal Reserve note can decline and depreciate against other fiat currencies as people begin to shift away from the United States dollar. So it gives some graphs here that are definitely worth taking a note of. And then it talks about here how the dollar's big slump. It says Wall Street sees risk of further losses. And so everything seems to be kind of downhill in regards to measuring the Federal Reserve note against other currencies such as the euro, the new installation of the renminbi into the basket of currency. So just more stuff here, but with some visual aids for yourself. But the next one here, I think is a very important one. It says dollar days as the world's most important currency are numbered, Berkeley economics professor states. So it gives you an idea of how we've kind of arrived at the situation. And then what I want to hit on is here, when asked about his thoughts and how he arrived at his data for his recent book, it says, according to The Economist, it says, from this vantage point, it is the second half of the 20th century that is the most anomaly, when an absence of alternatives allowed the dollar to become closer to monopolizing this international currency. And so he talks about how right after World War II, when the sterling pound was the world reserve currency, everyone kind of knew that it was coming towards an end. And so the only option at that point was to actually shift into dollars. And it says the author, who's an economic professor at the University of California, Berkeley, said the dollar's days as a dominant reserve currency will end sooner rather than later, and the speed of the shift might depend on the actions of U.S. President Donald Trump. It says the traditional view is that international currency status is a winner-take-all game, that there's room on the global stage for only one true international currency. It says the argument was that the network effect are so strong that they can create a natural monopoly because it pays to use the same currency in cross-border transactions that everybody else wants to use. And then it says here it's easier to switch between currencies now. So that's what makes the dollar not of much of value when it comes to retaining the reserve currency status. It's because there's more competition now. The next one here, it says the US dollar dominates global finance, but for how much longer? So it kind of piggybacks on that same story, but one thing that was worthy of picking out of this story, it says the greenback remains the main currency traded in foreign exchange markets. It is still the unit in which petroleum is priced, notwithstanding the complaints of Venezuelan leaders. So he ties in the idea that because petroleum is still priced in dollars, that kind of helps the dollar along. But yet, if you follow Rethinking the Dollar before, you kind of know that there's been a shift with that, with the yuan oil futures, as well as Venezuela creating its own crypto type of currency. So there's a shift outside of this mainstream narrative here. So that's going to play into this decline as well. It says, but this observation points to a contradiction at the heart of the 21st century globalization. It says back in 1960, a decade and a half after the conclusion of World War II, the U.S. accounted for 40% of the global economy, creating a logic for widespread international use for the dollar. With the recovery of Europe and the growth of the emerging markets, the U.S. share of global GDP has declined. It says today, following 2 decades of Chinese super growth, the U.S. share of global GDP is barely half of that 50 years ago. So with the growth of China, the GDP of the United States is not as dominant as it was a long time ago. So that's also going to play into decline. Another article here says the dollar days as the world's most important currency are numbered. I want to get into the idea that down here, the interviewer for this particular article asked some questions that I think are quite important. And it says, since the dollar has been mostly dominant since 1920s, so it's all we've ever known, and what will its loss be like status-wise? And so he gets into the idea that, on the other hand, if there is some kind of policy shock, which could be a financial or it could be a failure of the U.S. Congress to raise the debt ceiling, it could be a trade war, then I think it's possible to imagine things suddenly changing. So he's hinting at what could bring about this change. And this author here was mentioning how if there's some type of financial crisis or if the debt ceiling isn't raised. So that goes into the whole idea that we're at 21 trillion right now. And the debate is how much higher can it go before it causes a disruption. And so he's saying if we don't raise it, there's going to be a disruption. It says it would be very dramatic for treasuries to lose their reputation as a safe haven. So he goes on to talk about how as long as governments and countries have confidence in treasuries, they're willing to restore their reserves in the dollar. But yet if there's some reason they lose confidence or faith, and then he gives an example. He said, so let's imagine that South Korea and Japan conclude that the U.S. is not a reliable guarantor of their security. They have to develop their own defense capability. That could significantly diminish their relationship with the dollar. I don't attach a high probability of this happening, but things could fall apart. So if Japan or South Korea decide they don't feel confident in the United States of America's ability to help defend them and fight their wars, then definitely they can say, okay, we're going to go where who's going to help us. Then it talks about what are the benefits of a dominant reserve currency, and so it just shows the current foreign exchange reserves around the world, with the dollar being the lead currency. And so it goes on and on and on. But I wanted to get to the very last one. And so here in that prior article, it hints at the idea of the blockchain kind of being disruptive, and how Bitcoin is coming up in conversation nowadays as being an alternative as far as the blockchain technology being implemented by governments and central banks. And so he does agree that the Bitcoin has a ideal solution to decentralizing government, but he's saying that he doesn't believe the government's going to allow that to happen. And so there's going to be some type of taxation. And this plays into this article here. And it says, expect the U.S. to issue digital blockchain currency next year. And so this is CEO of Fire Apps, who's a currency exchange type of service. And so he shares his 3 reasons why he believes that this blockchain technology will be something to keep an eye on. And the first one is that the Federal Reserve has already begun making some type of plans with using it. And the second one is the fact that there's a Senate bill 1241, which is in discussion on how to regulate and convert the verbiage of this blockchain technology into some type of financial institution, which will lead to the third point, which is the whole taxation thing, how they may try to tax people out of the idea of using it. So, and the idea of them being able to issue their own. So just what's happening in the news. And so all these events all these events play into the idea that there's a lot of shifts happening in our monetary system in regards to the dollar and the Federal Reserve note being the primary source of stability for our current monetary system. And as things unravel out east with the development of China's debt, as well as events happening in Russia and all the stuff happening in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia and their oil and all the deals that's being done behind closed doors, it's all going to play into the role of the dollar being shifted from a reserve status to more of a just a local domestic currency. And at that point, that's when all those Federal Reserve notes is just scattered all over the planet have to come back home to their maker, and that's when we're going to start feeling the effects of inflation plus a lot of other things to come. And so it's interesting how all this Bitcoin craze is really becoming mainstream news, and a lot of economists as well as financial news stories are comparing or adding Bitcoin and the blockchain into their news stories as they talk about the dollar. And so it's being positioned as if they're kind of grooming us or preparing us for the thought of a blockchain type cryptocurrency being issued from the United States government or the central bank. And so it seems like they're preparing us for the idea that 2018, depending on how the markets react with the stock market all-time highs, no telling how long that's going to last, as well as this crypto craze of the blockchain coins going through the roof. So 2018 is setting up to be an interesting year because the dollar is under a lot of pressure with just fiat currency in and of itself, as our first article shows, but also on the other front with cryptocurrencies, a lot of pressure there as well, because people are choosing to opt out of Federal Reserve notes into cryptocurrencies in the idea of getting some gains as well as diversifying themselves away from a dying dollar. So just want to take the time to share this stories with you today. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think the Bitcoin craze and how it's being mentioned in the mainstream media more and more in relation to the dollar is a telling sign of what's coming in 2018? Let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts. Other than that, look forward to bringing you more news and updates. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.